Good morning, young scholars. This is chapter 2 of Slaughterhouse 5. I'm going to try to talk fast. There's a lot to go over. This is how I would organize it on the board in class, sort of graphically, so you can track where the plot is. As I mentioned in class, if you feel lost, pages 23 through 27 summarize Billy's life beginning to end. So that kind of crosses all the time periods, the war, post-war, his midlife, and Tralfamador, where he's kidnapped by the aliens. You'll notice this timeline always goes in order from Billy's being lost behind enemy lines with the two scouts and Weary through to their capture at the end of the chapter. All right, he will come unstuck and jump around, and in fact, the narrative, once it breaks off from this summary, actually begins in Billy's midlife with his grown daughter, Barbara. And he's in the basement writing letters about the UFOs, which is making her angry. This is her wedding night is the night he is kidnapped by the aliens. All right, but I'm going to start hitting a few key spots. First of all, this unstuck in time business is described on page 23. Billy's spastic in time. He has no control over where he is going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He is in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he is going to have to act in next. Some people confuse this as actual, well, I guess it is time travel, but his body doesn't physically go anywhere. It's just his sort of awareness. That's going to take a while to fully understand. It's like he's aware, you're aware you're here right now. It's just his awareness that shifts. He can jump around and suddenly be in a different time period. All right, then there is some, then like I said, there's Billy's life in a nutshell, which I'm not going to go over right now. It's pretty straightforward, but you can see he kind of stumbles through life. He survives the war, not because of any brilliant moves. He becomes rich just because he marries a girl whose father is in the optometry business, and he becomes rich. He also survives a plane crash, also another thing that has nothing to do with skill or intelligence. It's just dumb luck. This will be important as some of the themes that are coming up have to do with things like free will, technology, babies, perception. These are some themes that are left over from chapter 1 and will develop throughout the novel. I will talk about what this means even more. For example, Mary O'Hare is upset about the perception of war that can be illustrated in a novel or a movie, that it's glamorous, that it's brothers bonding as they fight evil. The concept of innocence or babies. Technology is something that I ask you about in the study guide. If we think of technology as the novel goes along as something that can be as simple as a camera or an elevator, which kills the vet who survived World War II. There's a little irony that it's his wedding ring that gets caught in the Lovebird car rendering on the elevator. So technology is something that will be a theme, especially because it's World War II and it's the first sort of technologically advanced war. We used airplanes for bombing, not just shooting each other. Our bombs were much more advanced, and of course, by the end of the war, we split the atom and use it as a bomb. Free will is a theme that doesn't seem to fit with an anti-war novel, and ultimately, we do want to see what all of these themes have to do with his main idea that he's writing an anti-war novel, and what does he mean by that? It's not just war is bad. He's going to have a specific critique of problem of war. All right, so on page 26, Vonnegut is talking about the aliens. Again, just a reminder, Vonnegut is not Billy Pilgrim. Billy Pilgrim is a fictional character. Okay, he just happens to be going through the same war experience that Kurt Vonnegut himself went through. But the Tralfamadorians are talking about their view of time. Again, this is also going to be something that the novel or Vonnegut tries to explain a little bit better as he goes along, but they essentially are in the fourth dimension, which is time. You have the three dimensions of physical space, and all of them occur in time. And since Tralfamadorians can see time the way we see space, they can see past, present, and future all at once. And in fact, when they look at a human, they can see us from birth to death. And Billy learns a lesson from them. On the bottom of 26, it says, the most important thing I learned on Tralfamador was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. He is still very much alive in the past, so it is very silly for people to cry at his funeral. All moments, past, present, and future, always have existed, always will exist. The Tralfamadorians can look at all the different moments just the way we can look at a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, for instance. They can see how permanent all the moments are, and they can look at any moment that interests them. It is just an illusion we have here on Earth that one moment follows another, like beads on the string, and that once a moment is gone, it is gone forever. And so when a Tralfamadorian sees a corpse, all he thinks is that that dead person is in bad condition at that particular moment, but that the person is fine, just fine in plenty of other moments. Now, when I myself hear that somebody is dead, I simply shrug and say what the Tralfamadorians say about dead people, which is, so it goes. So you see the Tralfamadorians give a different perception of death. They can see it differently, and so it affects them differently. It means very little to them. For Billy, this is comforting. He's writing these letters at the beginning of the chapter as if he is preaching to people, almost like he has discovered some truth that he has to share with the world. All right, on page 30, after this, we are in Luxembourg. We are behind enemy lines after the Battle of the Bulge, which is one of the most violent battles and the last successful German push to move the Allied forces front lines back. All right, on page 30, and so Billy says that he first came unstuck in time in 1944. So this is where he becomes unstuck in time. The aliens he meets in his midlife. Apparently, the two things are not connected. Even though the aliens can see all of time and Billy's unstuck in time, the two things are just coincidences, or so the book would have us believe, at least at this point. Okay, Billy's behind enemy lines with Roland Weary, who is an interesting character. Roland Weary was only 18 on page 35. Was at the end of an unhappy childhood spent mostly in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had been unpopular in Pittsburgh. He had been unpopular because he was stupid and fat and mean and smelled like bacon no matter how much he washed. He was always being ditched in Pittsburgh by people who did not want him with him. It made Weary sick to be ditched. When Weary was ditched, he would find somebody who was even more unpopular than himself. He would horse around with that person for a while, pretending to be friendly, and then he would find some pretext for beating the shit out of him. It was a pattern. It was a crazy, sexy, murderous relationship Weary entered into with people he eventually beat up. He told them about his father's collection of guns and swords and torture instruments and leg irons and so on. Weary's father, who was a plumber, actually did collect such things, and his collection was insured for $4,000. He wasn't alone. He belonged to a big club composed of people who collected things like that. So this element of Weary not wanting to be ditched obviously becomes important toward the end when the scouts ditch Weary and Billy. Weary is not an admirable character. Hopefully you notice something about Vonnegut's style there, where he uses a lot of redundancy. He had been unpopular in Pittsburgh. He had been unpopular because he was stupid and fat and mean and smelled like bacon no matter how much he washed. Those ends could have been replaced with commas, but Vonnegut is using syntax there to establish a tone that sort of, well, maybe I'll ask you about the effect later. Okay, moving forward, we get a lot of side trips on things that Weary's father owned, like the Iron Maiden, or the fact that Weary brought a knife to war, his own knife that has three-sided blade. It has brass knuckles and spikes coming off the knuckles. He is carrying that and his gun in the other hand. He is so wrapped up in clothing from home that he's kind of looking like Kenny from South Park. You can't really see him. He's mumbling in his head, coming up with this fantasy of the Three Musketeers, which would be the two scouts and Weary, not Billy. All right. There's some humor in here where Billy calls Weary calls Billy Joe College on page 38. That's an outdated way of looking at the world where you're sort of like, you can't learn everything from books, college boy. There's contempt for him. Of course, all Billy had was 6 months of night school in optometry. He wasn't exactly what you would call a college boy or an intellect. All right, there's some reference to Billy growing up. We actually jump off of this a few times to his childhood. I just didn't want to put that whole timeline on here. That would take him somewhere back over here, where he grows up with a crucifix on his wall that frightens him, even though he's not Catholic. Billy, by the way, his job in the war is a chaplain's assistant, which makes him completely ridiculous. A chaplain simply, well, not simply, a chaplain performs the religious services for any religion in the army, but an assistant just carries around his stuff. So Billy doesn't have a gun. He came back from his father's funeral, so he doesn't have shoes appropriate to the war. He's wearing his dress shoes. One of the heels came off, so he's bobbing up and down as he travels. He's ridiculous looking, shaped like a Coca-Cola bottle, already balding at his age, his early 20s, and ready to give up. But we're still on this sort of side tangent where we also get this history of the photograph Billy Weary is carrying around. And this is where I think of the theme of technology. We take a side trip for a full 2 pages, page 40 and 41, where we learn that almost immediately upon discovering or inventing the camera, a brilliant bit of ingenuity that would allow people to record themselves for posterity, to see other sides of the world, to connect humanity in ways that hadn't been connected. And within a few months, it was being used for porn, basically like the internet. All right. So there is, within here, I ask you also to track Weary's true version of the war story. And much like we had to do with Cora, we have to note that that's in complete contrast with what Vonnegut's narration tells us. Now, of course, the narration here is very different than Faulkner's. Vonnegut's an omniscient third-person narrator. He knows everything about everybody. He takes us on these tangents where we know not only about Weary's childhood, but the things his father collected. Then also the photo in his pocket. We then get the full history of that photo. These things may confuse you. You feel lost. Like, what are we talking about this for? And then we come back to the story. All right, but in his head, Weary's true version of the war story is that he was a hero. His version of the true war story went like this. There was a big German attack, and Weary and his anti-tank buddies fought like hell until everybody was killed but Weary. So it goes. And then Weary tied in with 2 scouts, and they became close friends immediately, and they decided to fight their way back to their own lines. They were going to travel fast. They were damned if they'd surrender. They shook hands all around. They called themselves the 3 Musketeers. But then this damn college kid, who was so weak he shouldn't even have been in the army, asked if he could come along. He didn't even have a gun or a knife. He didn't have a helmet or a cap. He couldn't even walk right. Kept bobbing up and down, driving everybody crazy, giving their position away. He was pitiful. The 3 Musketeers pushed and carried and dragged the college kid all the way back to their own lines. Weary's story went. They saved his goddamn hide for him. Obviously, there's some humor in there. Billy shouldn't have been in the war while everybody was drafted. He didn't have a choice. I'm running low on time for the recording, so I'm going to jump through this. You want to be able to contrast that to the actual story. I'll let you do that on your own. This has to do with how we know anything about history. If Mary O'Hare heard that he was building this heroic story in his head, it would upset her. How do we know? How do we perceive what goes on in war? We get stories from people who were in it. We get stories from generals. We get stories of battles. This will be an emerging theme. How do we know? What is our perception of history? All right. Billy jumps back in time. We go to Little League. We find out how we learned to swim. One of the things I was going over here for is you may have noticed that 3 Musketeers is the name Weary gives to him, his little group. It's also the candy bar that the horrid woman that Vonnegut called in chapter 1 was chewing on when he described the death of the veteran.